Welcome to America's Talking. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. America's Talking is a production of America's Talking Network. You can check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. Today, on this episode of America's Talking, we'll be discussing convictions and presidential campaigns. And joining me to discuss this today is the Center Square's executive editor, Dan McCaleb. Dan, welcome back to America's Talking.
Thanks for having me, Cole.
We have the investigative reporter for the Center Square, Brett Rowland, kind of the man of the hour here with a couple convictions. Brett, welcome to America's Talking.
Thanks for having me.
We also have the Center Square's Washington D.C. Bureau Chief Casey Harper. Casey, welcome back to America's Talking.
Thanks, Cole. Good to be here.
All right, Brett, I want to start with you. You've done the vast majority of the coverage on a couple pretty important convictions here. We'll start with the primarily unprecedented conviction of a former president, Donald Trump. Let's talk about the charges, the conviction, and really where we're at this time of the recording. We're recording this on June 11th. Brett, what's going on with the Trump convictions? Then we'll get to the Hunter Biden convictions here in a moment.
So things are moving forward after a jury convicted Trump of 34 counts of falsifying business records to cover up hush money payments he made to an adult actress before the 2016 election. He was convicted on all 34 counts, and his sentencing has been set for July 11th. But before that can happen, he's had to do a few other things. For example, yesterday he met with the New York's probation office in a telephone or video interview with his lawyer present. And that will help set the stage for what Trump could face at sentencing. Now, under New York law, he could face up to 4 years per count. Most people think that that's fairly unlikely, and something lighter than that will come down. But the probation office's report will be one factor the judges considers, along with arguments from the prosecutor and from Trump's defense team in that. So as that process goes forward, though, all eyes seem to be on the political side of things, which is what's going to happen November 5th.
Yeah, so we have an unprecedented conviction of a former president, and also the presumptive nominee for a major party in the United States, the Republican Party. Casey, I want to go to you. Brett mentioned the political aspect of this. There was speculation that if former President Trump was convicted of a felony that could hurt his polling numbers, his chances of a second term in office as president. What has been the political fallout of these convictions in the state of New York?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there was an expectation of political fallout. I mean, just a few years ago, an offhanded, inappropriate comment could sink your presidential campaign. But in this sort of post-Trump, post-cancellation era that I think we've transitioned into, just not the case anymore for either candidate. We have one candidate whose son is, facing a conviction, and the other candidate who himself is facing conviction. And so, I took a dive looking at the different polls that have been conducted, not just released after Trump's conviction, but actually where they surveyed voters, likely voters, registered voters, whatever it may be, after the news of the conviction came out. And honestly, a bit to my surprise, I found that while there was, in some polls, it maybe seemed that Trump took a bit of a hit. Overall, these 34 counts have failed to sink Trump's presidential campaign. If you thought that that jury verdict was going to be the nail in the coffin for a very elusive Donald Trump, you were entirely wrong. He, at least for now, has escaped unscathed. Now whether if he ends up behind bars, that could change it. There are more things coming, of course, but as of now, over a week out from this conviction, it seems business as usual, despite these convictions for the former president.
And Dan, Casey mentioned business as usual, but this is certainly not business as usual when it comes to the history of the United States. There have been certainly scandals associated with presidents. I think obviously the ones in the last 60 years or so here that come to mind. You have President Clinton, President Nixon. This feels noticeably different than those situations. Dan, how do you read this? I mean, there's the criminal aspect, there's the political aspect, but then there's this cultural aspect to it as well.
Yeah, it seems like everything surrounding Donald Trump is unprecedented and has changed the rules of the political game nationally. As Brett mentioned, Trump is potentially facing prison time. Doesn't mean he'll get it. But if he is sentenced to prison, not only will we have the first former president convicted of felonies, we'll have the first former president who's campaigning for the White House from a jail cell. Casey mentioned, there's uncertainty as to whether or not that would end Trump's campaign. He said he will campaign from a jail cell. And it could help him. Trump's base, most Republicans are sticking by them, have called this trial where he was convicted in New York City in the hush money case, political lawfare, a political prosecution, essentially aided by the Biden's Department of Justice. Now, those are just allegations, of course, but many in the Trump camp, most in the Trump camp, agree with that sentiment, and it could make even Donald Trump even more of a martyr to his base. So, yes, everything that's gone on around this election cycle has been unusual. Both Donald Trump and Joe Biden dominated the primary season. They both are the likely nominees. But then you've got the Republican candidate, facing potential jail time, and you've got the other, the Democratic candidate, with questions about his mental capacity and viability, and whispers on the Democratic side that despite winning the primaries, that he might be replaced at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August. So it's weird. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's certainly weird. And Casey, Dan just discussed a little bit. I mean, the reason Donald Trump has been able to weather these political storms, still be the presumptive Republican nominee, is because of his popularity with his base. And it does seem like modern politics is very different than politics 30, 40 years ago, where the establishment party would put political pressure on a candidate, potentially like Donald Trump, where now you can go directly to the voter. And Trump has, with his base, it's undeniable. You like Trump, you don't like Trump, you feel neither here nor there about Trump. You cannot deny his popularity with his base, and it is very strong right now.
I mean, sure, it is, and maybe stronger than ever. That's undeniable. But I would say, in a certain way, Trump's message actually also makes these attacks kind of Teflon, because when you're the anti-establishment candidate, as Trump certainly has positioned himself to be, every attack from the establishment just makes your point for you. Right. And so that's kind of the benefit of being the outsider, the anti-establishment. When the media attacked Trump, as they voraciously did, especially in the 2016, it only made him stronger, because he said, this is the establishment media. The media is the enemy of the people. This is why I'm running. You see these crazy attacks. This is why I'm running. And it's the same thing with, what some are calling lawfare here. Whenever the establishment, the system comes for Trump, it just strengthens him in a certain sense among his base, because he says, this is what I was warning you. He basically makes himself a self-fulfilling prophet, because he warns the people that the establishment is coming to get them. So when the establishment comes after him, it is a sign that his prophecy has been fulfilled, right? And so being anti-establishment has given him that cover. But it's not just that. He has also had the benefit of having political cover from his opponents, because both Democrats that Trump has run against have had their own string of shady, questionable political corruption allegations. I mean, Hillary Clinton was anything but squeaky clean. And so, Trump had his different scandals. He had his casinos. He had, potential bankruptcies, his taxes. But Hillary had her emails. And so it all kind of washed out in the end. And I think, we're seeing the same thing here with Biden, to the point about, will Biden be replaced? I mean, Biden's own son, I don't have to go into the whole Hunter Biden situation, but Hunter Biden's own son, the allegations against the president for his potential involvement in dealings overseas, in Ukraine and other places, it's more than enough to give Trump political cover and say, you think I'm corrupt? Have you looked at what Biden has been doing? And so he's had that benefit from both Hillary and the current president. So I think that actually if Democrats somehow pulled off a miracle and replaced Biden, they would have a strong chance. But man, replacing an incumbent who is the clear front runner right now, that it's possible, but it's quite a feat.
Yeah, and beyond this conviction in New York on the business dealings case, Brett, there are also other charges against the former president that are still hanging out there right now. Let's briefly go into that a little bit to discuss how those charges could potentially add on to the conviction count for the former president.
That's a good point. So In Florida, the president faces multiple counts of mishandling classified documents, sharing them with people who weren't allowed to see them, and then refusing to give them back. That case is going through some classified procedures right now, but the judge did rule just within the last day that she would not dismiss the case outright as Trump had wanted, but did make some changes to the indictment. In Georgia, he faces charges of election interference. That case remains on pause while Trump and some of the other co-defendants in that case appeal a judge's decision to let the prosecutor, who had a personal relationship with another district attorney prosecuting the case, while the appeals court reviews that decision. That case is sort of on pause. And then the Washington D.C. case, which is the second and final federal case, also remains on pause, waiting for the Supreme Court's decision on presidential immunity.
And Dan, you just heard a litany more of charges against former president. You mentioned his popularity with his base and really how this most recent conviction has not impacted his poll numbers very much. Do you see any of these being different than the New York case? Because the New York case it seems like a different level. Yes, there were felonies, but it was a different level of seriousness. And I think a lot of people felt that way about the convictions in terms of the real impact or the real crime there. Do you think that the Georgia and Florida cases are going to be viewed any different, or will it be viewed very much through that same lens of, hey, this might be politics creeping into the justice system?
I think it's going to be it would be the same thing. One, I don't know that any of those other three cases that Brett just talked about are going to go to trial before November, the November presidential election. In fact, it looks almost like for certain that they will not. But in the event that any do, I don't think it'll hurt Trump any more than the New York City case did. In Florida, in Miami, the classified documents case, you had President Joe Biden from his days as vice president under Barack Obama had classified documents in his garage and in one of his private offices that were found years after he left the White House. A special prosecutor appointed that to case essentially said, we're not going to bring charges here. But because he didn't think he could persuade a jury over Biden's mental competency in that case. Of course, you also had former Vice President Mike Pence, who had classified documents after he left the White House. He was not charged with a crime. The Georgia case, where Brett mentioned the personal relationship between Fannie Wills and one of her other prosecutors, there's really questions about her viability and whether or not this was politically motivated prosecution or not. And then the Washington, D.C. case relates to the January 6th riots at the Capitol building and whatnot. That's been in the news and litigated by voters every day for nearly 4 years now. There's not going to be anything new out of that voters don't already know. And we've shown, even since January 6th, Trump's popularity has only gotten bigger. So no, the short answer is I don't see any of those cases mattering to voters.
Casey, I think one of the interesting things here is we've talked a lot about, okay, the base, the people that like Trump, continue to like Trump. The question, you get a presidential election year is, will these things be the straw that breaks the camel's back for those independent voters, those undecided voters, those people that say, hey, I really don't like either of these candidates? Does this play an impact in these things as you see it, Casey?
Yeah, I mean, of course it's going to impact somebody. It's really the question is a percentage. I mean, we had a Center Square Voters Voice poll that found, I think it's 84%, I believe, said that they would still vote for Trump if he was convicted. Now, this is so far out. I think that number is really just an estimate, and it could waver either way. But it was really telling that the vast majority of people would stand by Trump if he was convicted, who wanted to vote for him. I think, you can't boil this election down to one issue. I mean, the prices are up about 20% since Biden took office. I mean, that's a crazy number, 20%. Things are 20% more expensive than when President Joe Biden took office. And that's a huge factor for voters. Of course, inflation's been a big part of that, energy, gas prices, all that. And so, what does your average American care more about? That, Trump filed some papers wrong and maybe lied on a government filing, or that their groceries are 20% more expensive or 30% more expensive. I think that's one thing. And the other thing is, this is not 2016 all over again. Trump has made big inroads, for instance, with Hispanics. I mean, Trump's support among Hispanics is pretty incredible for a Republican and for a candidate who was accused up and down of being anti-Hispanic and racist for his border wall support for so long. He's made incredible inroads among Hispanic voters and Black voters. I mean, he is. If you compare Trump's support among these demographics to, for instance, Mitt Romney's a few years ago, it's kind of laughable how much better Trump is doing. So he has shifted the demographic a little bit. Of course, more than enough ink has been spilled about how Trump has, gathered in working class voters. But so this is not just 2016 all over again. It's a totally different economy. Trump, if you remember, Trump was doing very well in the last election until COVID came around, and he just wasn't seen as capable of handling COVID. It really hurt the economy. But it's different now. The economy, in the mind of many voters, has not been handled well by Biden. COVID is a distant memory. Trump has made inroads with minorities. When Trump was in office, there was really no wars, and now we have wars breaking out everywhere. Oh, and by the way, there are these convictions that Trump has had. That's the way people are looking at it. I think it's one piece of a larger puzzle. And of all those issues, Trump being accused of misfiling paperwork impacts the average voter's life least of all of those issues than a potential foreign war, than the price of groceries or anything else.
All right, let's go from one conviction to another impactful conviction this election cycle. Again, I mentioned we're recording this on June 11th. Today, Brett, a Biden got convicted on some gun charges as well. So let's discuss this and this. It's a merry-go-round of convictions this election cycle, it seems.
That's right. So a jury in Delaware today convicted Hunter Biden of 3 gun charges related to his use of crack cocaine. So 2 of the counts involve allegations that he lied on a federal form, saying that he was not using illegal drugs when he bought a .38 Colt Special revolver in October 2018. The third count alleges that he possessed the firearm while using illicit drugs. So he was found guilty on all 3 of those charges. The jury was out for about 3 hours of total deliberations and came back with the guilty verdicts. In the immediate aftermath, President Joe Biden has said that he is not going to interfere with that verdict. And he has said outright that he would not pardon his son. So we'll have to see where that goes. A sentencing date has not been set in that case, but Hunter Biden faces up to 10 years on the first 2 counts and 5 years on the third, so maybe 25 years in total. Although for a first-time offender, it's unlikely he'd face the maximum.
Dan, have you ever seen anything like this? I mean, that's a very genuine, candid question, but you have one presidential nominee who's been convicted and has other charges out there. You have another one whose son has been convicted, all within about a 3-week span. I mean, this seems like a cultural moment. I keep going back to that, but history books are going to, write about this 4-week time period in 2024, it seems.
This is where you're supposed to call me a seasoned, Cole. In my long years, decades in journalism, have I seen anything like this? The answer is,
can you remember if you've seen it, Dan? I don't know. That might be the question.
Dan is what we call a legacy reporter.
Getting back to Cole's question, no, this is craziness. I think the gun charge, the gun conviction against Hunter Biden, I think that's might be a footnote in the history books here. Now, there's other allegations that when President Joe Biden was vice president, that Casey referenced this, Hunter Biden used then Vice President Biden's influence to earn millions of dollars overseas. The Republican-led House, that investigation is still ongoing. I think that would be more impactful, more significant than Hunter Biden's admitted drug use and the jury's decision that he attempted to buy a gun, or he did buy a gun after lying on background check forms about his drug use. But it's the son of a sitting president. This is craziness. But it is what it is.
It is what it is indeed. But I mean, Casey, does this, I hate to say this so flippantly, but does this Hunter Biden conviction really mean anything out? I mean, it's going to give fodder to right wing talking points, obviously, and that sort of thing. But do you actually think this will impact? Dan said it might be a footnote in history. I largely agree with him. But do you see any real impact coming out of this conviction, at least this one, if it only stays at the gun charges?
Right. I mean, yeah, there's kind of a news cycle impact now, but I think in some sense, Hunter Biden being unconvicted was more hurtful to Democrats because it was kind of a blatant hypocrisy. The crack addict president's son allegedly, was, doing all these things and hasn't gone to jail, but Trump, fills out one little form wrong and gets, that's kind of the narrative on the right, that Trump gets behind bars. Of course, Dan pointed out also that the president mishandled classified documents allegedly in basically the same way, but wasn't charged with it. So this kind of hypocrisy thing plays into Trump's anti-establishment narrative. I think actually a more interesting angle to me, and I might pitch it back to Dan on this, is, the president saying he won't pardon his own son is so interesting to me. I think at first blush, it makes sense because you don't want to be seen as hypocritical, but I mean, would you really not pardon your own son if you had the power to, and he was in prison for 10 years? I actually don't think Americans would really fault the president for pardoning his own son. I mean, isn't that a kind of loyalty? How does that play? I mean, you really willing to let your son rot in jail so it doesn't knock 3 points off of your electoral hopes? It's a very interesting question.
Yeah, I don't know if sentencing has been set yet for Hunter Biden, but theoretically, Joe Biden could wait until after the election to make that hard decision. Win or lose, it wouldn't matter after the election for Joe Biden's political ambitions. So I question that as well, particularly if Hunter Biden gets significant jail time. As Brett said, because he's a first-time offender, probably not. So I don't know that he'd have to make that decision, but it's still a decision he might.
Yeah, Casey, kind of what you're getting at, I think, to a degree. It goes back to the Michael Dukakis debate question of sorts on the death penalty when they asked about his wife, if someone committed these crimes against his wife, if he'd be for the death penalty. And he said, well, no, I would not be. And it was that idea of being a principled stand, not being a hypocrite, that sort of thing. But it kind of landed tone deaf. Is that what you're getting at a little bit, Casey?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yes, that's a great example of it. I think it's just kind of human element of family first. I think it's a deep American value. When you talk about principles, it's bipartisan. It's certainly a value among independents. So I'm not sure that Biden would really make a lot of enemies by pardoning his son, except for those among the right who would make heyday of it. But I mean, one thing I'll say is I believe if Biden loses the election, he can still pardon his son. He's still in office for a few months.
Yes, he could.
So
yes.
He could, or a few weeks. So he could pardon his son after a November loss.
I want to wrap up here, guys. But Dan, I got a last question for you. We use the word unprecedented a lot in this podcast, and there's a reason, because this has not really happened before in American history. I don't want to say circling the drain, right? That feels dramatic, but this does feel a little deflating to what I'm going to broadly call the American experiment. I mean, there's something about all of this that feels very disappointing to me personally. I guess I'll say it that way, that this is where we're at, that you have a president convicted, probably did the crimes, right? He's got convicted in a court of law. So at the same point, you have that. At the other side, you have a political celebration because of that, having a former president convicted because it benefits them politically. At the same time, you have the sitting president's son be convicted. I mean, it as an American who wants to see the success of the American experiment, as it's been referred to, this is disheartening to me on a personal level.
Well, and I think a lot of voters agree with you, Cole. Take away the charges against Trump and the convictions against Trump. Take away the allegations, against President Biden, the conviction of his son, Hunter Biden. People think they're too old anyway, both of them. Certainly, President Joe Biden has shown some obvious decline in his public appearances. President Trump, maybe not so much. But President Trump first ran in 2015 and won in 2016. We're now a decade later. Biden was a U.S. senator for, God, how many decades? Where's the fresh blood? Where's the new ideas? Where are the younger politicians? And of course, you can't blame the candidates themselves. The primary voters are the ones that nominated these two today or this year and 4 years ago. But Casey referenced the Center Square's Voters' Voice poll. We asked a question like that several months ago, and barely anybody, I think the question had to do with, are you excited about a potential rematch of 2020? And barely anybody said, yeah, they're excited about Biden versus Trump again in 2024.
Yeah, I just think it begs the question, is this, you look at polls and everybody's sick of polarization, Dan. It's amazing to me. Everybody hates polarization, yet it continues to happen. It keeps getting worse. But it really seems like this phenomena that occurs when people talk about, hey, they hate Congress, but they love their representative type thing. Is this what we're seeing here? Well, I hate polarization as long as it's polarization from the other side, right? I mean, that just seems to be the same thing. And with social media, with more information than ever, I always kind of joke, you can just go to imright.com and find whatever thing you want to find and just feel validated. Again, just feels like we're going to be, I mentioned the conviction merry-go-round, but it just feels like we're going to keep going on this American politics merry-go-round for a while.
Well, I do think, not making any guarantees, certainly not. This will absolutely be the last election cycle for Joe Biden, even if he's still on the ballot after the Democratic National Convention in August. It more likely than not will be the last election cycle for Donald Trump. Yeah, that means we're going to probably have to put up with one or the other of them for 4 more years. Put up is critical term, I realize that. But I think in 4 years, granted, that's a long time from now, we'll be past this Biden, Trump, Clinton sort of dynasties with the same people are running all the time, I think.
You think? Yeah, I know. That's what I think too. But they're Don Trump Jr. is sitting right there, and you never know. So, Dan, Casey, Brett, I mean, these things it's going to keep up in the news. There's going to be more news. There's going to be more potential convictions. There's going to be the actual, the date where we learn about if Trump is going to jail, if he's not going to jail. And it's, it's great. I think it's great for news coverage. I just, you wonder about the country. So you hope that we can, again, remember we're all Americans and what the country's all about. So Dan, Casey, Brett, thanks for joining us today. You listeners can check out all of these stories and more, keep up with the convictions, the trials at thecentersquare.com. And if you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Check out our other podcasts at americastalking.com. I'm Cole McNeely, and thanks for listening to America's Talking. We'll catch you back next time.